Among the film distributors in Canada, Alliance Films was probably the most prolific. There was even a time when it was common for them to release a new film every week, whether it was a local production or a film made by one of their American partners. Alliance was first founded in 1984 and primarily produced Canadian television shows and movies. However, they also sought to release independent American films in Canada, signing a lucrative deal with New Line Cinema. Alliance also had a brief period when they served as the Canadian distributor for the Samuel Goldwyn Company and Sony Pictures Classics. In 1994, Alliance signed a deal with Miramax to release their movies up north, a partnership that lasted for several years. However, they still maintained an interest in helping to finance Canadian films. One was the science fiction film Johnny Mnemonic, starring Keanu Reeves and co-produced by TriStar. There was also David Cronenberg's much talked about and controversial movie Crash, and Adam McGowan's Oscar-nominated drama The Sweet Hereafter. Their biggest competitor in the Canadian distribution business was Cineplex Odeon Films, yes, owned by the movie theater company. Alliance's combination of Miramax and New Line titles, along with their own homegrown hits, allowed them to make a name for themselves in the Canadian market and more than hold their own against the Hollywood majors, which typically take up a significant amount of the box office up here. 1998 was a game-changing year when they merged with Atlantis Communications to form Alliance Atlantis, and thus became even more powerful. That same year, they acquired Odeon Films and their library from Cineplex. If you went to see a Canadian movie or a film from one of the notable American independent film companies, there's a good chance you would see the Alliance Atlantis logo at the start. Alliance would continue to sign distribution deals with other American indies, including Artisan Entertainment and the Universal-owned Focus Features. When Harvey and Bob Weinstein left Miramax and started the Weinstein Company in 2005, they continued their association with Alliance Films. There was a brief period when Miramax films were distributed by Maple Pictures, a distribution company owned by Lionsgate. However, Alliance then acquired Maple in 2011, which led to them handling Lionsgate titles in Canada, along with renewing their old partnership with Miramax. Back to Canadian films, Alliance was usually responsible for the country's biggest local hits. One of the most notable was the comedy Men with Brooms, which centered on a curling team. That's right, one of Canada's most successful films is about curling. Shocking, I know. And in case you weren't aware, ice hockey is also popular in Canada, which explains the success of The Rocket, a biopic about legendary Montreal Canadian player Maurice Richard. Alliance was also responsible for Daniel Kahn's The Barbarian Invasions, which won the Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film, and St. Ralph, an inspirational sports drama about a teenager who competes in the Boston Marathon. Alliance films scored impressive box office numbers with the comedy Bon Cop, Bad Cop, about a policeman from Ontario who teams up with a policeman from Quebec. Audiences, mainly in Quebec, responded to its depiction of the odd couple relationship between two cops from different provinces, and it became the highest-grossing Canadian film in Canada. The previous record holder? Porky's. Another hit Canadian film from that time was Trailer Park Boys the Movie, based on the successful television series. Cronenberg's gangster film, Eastern Promises, was partly financed by Alliance and distributed by them in Canada. It became one of his most highly regarded films, and another feather in the cap for Canadian cinema. And a Canadian movie that found a following in the United States was the raunchy comedy Goon, starring Sean William Scott as a violent hockey player, and with a script written by Jay Baruchel and Seth Rogen's frequent collaborator, Evan Goldberg. If you live outside of Canada and have seen your fair share of Canadian films, it's highly likely Alliance had a hand in funding some of them. One setback for them did occur when New Line was absorbed into Warner Brothers in 2008. Alliance was allowed to continue distributing their movies in Canada for one more year, but after 2009 they lost one of the most important American partners. That wasn't the only loss for Alliance. In 2008, Echo Bridge acquired the rights to several of their television productions, including the famous Jet Jackson, Reboot, and Degrassi: The Next Generation. Some pretty big heavy hitters there, many of which are now owned by Wildbrain. A big sea change would come for Alliance Atlantis when they were acquired by Entertainment One, or eOne, in 2013. eOne was already starting to establish a major footprint in the Canadian film market for a while by making a distribution deal with Summit Entertainment, the studio behind the Twilight movies. However, with this purchase, eOne became the biggest distributor of films in Canada. The distribution deals Alliance had made with the Weinstein Company, Focus Features, Lionsgate, and others would continue though. eOne would also pick up the occasional film from new companies like Annapurna and A24 for release in Canada. They continued to handle Canadian films too, like the animated movie Snowtime, plus sequels to Bon Cop, Bad Cop, and Goon. Funnily enough, even though the films would now be released under the eOne name, the logo played Alliance's old fanfare. eOne appeared to be chugging along quite nicely through the 2010s, and much like during the Alliance days, it was common for them to release a new movie every week or two. However, their Hollywood partners would make decisions that would significantly decrease that output. In 2016, Universal Pictures chose to handle the international distribution of Focus Features, including in Canada, putting an end to that deal. In 2017, the Harvey Weinstein scandal resulted in the Weinstein Company selling its upcoming films elsewhere and the studio filing for bankruptcy. This actually led to a lawsuit from eOne regarding one of those movies, Paddington 2, after the North American rights was sold to Warner Brothers. eOne had already spent money on marketing the film in Canada and stated TWC owed them compensation when the rights changed. Then in 2019, Lionsgate ended their partnership with eOne to start a new distribution deal with Cineplex and Mongrel Media. Interesting enough, the person responsible for that was Victor Lowy, the former CEO of Alliance Films. eOne's library of titles has also started dwindling. The Canadian rights to New Line's films have been reverting to Warner Brothers, and the Focus Features titles have also been slowly returning to Universal. Ditto with the Lionsgate movies. They still have the Miramax films up here, despite Paramount buying a stake in the studio, but who knows how long they will get to keep them. 2019 would see eOne acquired by toy company Hasbro for $4 billion. Why do they want this Canadian distributor? While the library could be considered attractive, the main reason was because eOne owned the rights to the extremely popular children's show Peppa Pig. In fact, that's all most articles revealing the acquisition mentioned. A few months after that deal closed, the pandemic happened, and like every other entertainment company, they had to deal with theater closures and other issues. eOne would pivot some of their films to streaming or VOD, while Hasbro chose to focus on using eOne to help produce movies and shows based on their various toy properties. A lot of the movies that would have ordinarily been released by Alliance or eOne back in the day started being handled by other Canadian distributors, with Elevation Pictures, VBS Films, Level Film, and others making deals with indie studios like A24 and Neon. There was the occasional eOne release like Clifford the Big Red Dog and Happiest Season, but still a small fraction compared to the number of movies they used to bring to Canadian theaters. About a year ago, it was quietly revealed that eOne would downsize its operations and end theatrical distribution in Canada, a major blow for the local film industry. eOne was originally going to release The Woman King in Canada, but Sony would do that instead. The same goes for Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves, which was released by Paramount. eOne is still listed as a producer on those movies, with the logo appearing at the start. However, the name is nowhere to be found on Transformers Rise of the Beast, despite initially being revealed as a producer. The social media accounts for eOne Films Canada have also been quiet since July of last year. Curiously, eOne is still active in the United Kingdom, not only releasing Dungeons & Dragons over there, but the Fablemans as well. Over the past several months, Hasbro has been looking to sell off eOne to any interested buyers. Darren Throop, the founder of eOne, has been talking with Hasbro about buying back his company, although Lionsgate and Legendary Pictures have also expressed interest. Regardless of who will be its next parent company, Hasbro has made it clear they're keeping Peppa Pig. It's really sad to see what happened to Alliance Films, which helped bring so many notable films to Canada and was pivotal to the growth of the local film industry during the 90s and 2000s. Nonetheless, their contributions will always be remembered. See you next time.